Good evening and welcome to the New School for this panel on Robert Mondavi. We waited a few more minutes because of the weather, and apparently the trains are not running too regularly, so we give it 5 more minutes, but we're very glad that we're here. My name is Fabio Parasecoli. I'm the coordinator of the Food Studies program here at the New School. And just wanted to tell you a little bit about this program. It started officially in 2008, but classes on food had already been taught here, and actually Andy Smith, he's the moderator for this panel, has been here since basically the beginning of the program, right?
The beginning of the New School,
or the beginning of the New School, as he's saying. So over the years, the program has developed, and it is still developing. We have classes that go from history, the classes that Andy teaches, to media and culture, the sort of classes that I teach, politics, economics, policy. So we hope that the program will grow, students are interested, and we also are very interested in continuing organizing these public events. As you know, the New School has in its mission sort of the connection with the community. And so this series of the Culinary Luminaries actually is part of that. We've had other panels in this series, and we covered big names like James Beard, Julia Child, and the last two were about Pellegrino Artusi and Michael Batterberry. All our classes also are open to the public. So if you're interested in knowing more about food, you can check our catalog. They change every semester. I'm sure that you would find something that you're interested in. One last thing, and then I'll introduce Andy more properly. The Food Studies program and the writing program here at the New School are launching a new sort of food magazine online. The name is The Inquisitive Eater, and hopefully it will start at the beginning of next month. And we want it to be a place where our students, both undergraduate and graduate, can publish their food-related stuff, but we also hope to receive material from the communities. As we said, for us it's very important that this dialogue goes on. So you're more than welcome to check it out. We'll send out an announcement when it's launched, and we would welcome your contributions. So now for tonight's program, I'll introduce the moderator, Andy Smith, and he will introduce all the panelists. Andy is a very well-known and prolific writer. In the past few months, he came out with 4 books. The Junk Food and Fast Food, the Encyclopedia of What We Love to Eat. It's a 2-volume encyclopedia that came out with Greenwood. He published Potato, A Global History, in a series that he's actually the editor of. Starving the South, Out the North Won the Civil War, and American Tuna, The Rise and Fall of an Improbable Food, published with University of California Press. And is also working on the second edition of the extremely successful Oxford Encyclopedia of Food and Drink in America that he edited a few years ago. So please welcome Andy Smith.
Thank you, Frank. Actually, I just told him all I really wanted to have him say was, he's a nice guy, but academics have other needs. I am thankful that all of you have come on a rainy day, and I am particularly thankful that our 4 panelists are here. In my opinion, the best 4 panelists possible to talk about Robert Mondavi and his legacy. I'm delighted to introduce each of them. We will go through each presentation and then open it up to questions at the end. Not to discourage you from asking questions, but when the questions are over, the wine will be served. I just thought I'd mention that in passing. So our first panelist will be Julia Flynn Siler. She is the author of The House of Mondavi, The Rise and Fall of an American Wine Dynasty. I have twisted her arm, and I just want you to know that we do have copies of the book over there. And just this one time, she's agreed to autograph them if you want to buy one. I just thought I'd mention that in passing. Also, much to my surprise, she is also the author of a book that just came out 2 weeks ago, right? Or even
very recently.
Within a matter of weeks, titled Lost Kingdom, Hawaii's Last Queen, The Sugar Kings, and America's First Imperial Venture. So I'm sorry we don't have copies of that. If I'd known it had been coming out, I would have encouraged the school to have acquired copies of that too. Our second speaker will be Frank J. Prial. Frank is the author of actually 3 books, Wine Talks, Decantations, Reflections on Wine, and The Wine Companion, but I think he's known more to all of us as the formal New York Times wine columnist. Our third speaker will be Tyler Colman, who has spoken here. You spoke here during the summer for our program on drinking, so we hope you'll be coming back to next summer's class too. It's on a book titled, author of the book, Wine Politics, How Governments, Environmentalists, Mobsters and Critics Influence the Wines We Drink. And I've twisted his arm too, and he has also agreed to autograph books should you wish to buy one over there at the end of the presentation. And I just want you to know he's being secretive about what he's doing next. All I can do is say it's wine related and it's an app. That's all that can be said. So just for your but maybe you can ask him some questions and he'll feel obligated to comment, at least off camera, if not on camera. Our final speaker is Charles Scicolone. Did I get it right?
Close enough.
And close enough. Charles is a sommelier and wine consultant. He is also the co-author of Pizza Any Way You Slice It with his wife, Michelle. Michelle, you've got to at least raise your hand. Come on. And to me, that's a perfect, having just finished a book on fast food and junk food, it's a perfect combination. Pizza and wine sounds good to me. So all I can do is welcome all 4 of our panelists, and thank you very much. Julie?
Thank you, Andy. I'm delighted to be up here with such a distinguished panel. And I'm afraid we're going to have to wait to raise our glasses. We can do that afterwards. But to Robert Mondavi himself. He died peacefully at the age of 94 in the Napa Valley. And what a marvelous character he was. I had so much fun learning about him. He had a great sense of humor, and he was willing to poke fun at himself and his very passionate family. He once wore a T-shirt to a company picnic, and this T-shirt said, just imagine it, "Get revenge, live long enough to be a problem to your children." Okay, well, that's what my book, The House of Mondavi, is really, really about. Harvard Business School has done 6 case studies on the Robert Mondavi Corporation, and that their story is more like King Lear in some ways than it is like a business school case study. Just a marvelous story. And I got into it because I wrote a Wall Street Journal story. I really knew nothing. I'm a Californian. I knew nothing about Mondavi. I knew almost nothing about wine. As Frank could tell you, I think. I'm not a connoisseur when we
I know less than you.
So any case, I was a reporter. I'm still a reporter. And what happened was in 2004, Robert's eldest son and his heir apparent had stepped down as the chairman of the Robert Mondavi Corporation, which was a publicly traded company. And that seemed really unusual. And my boss at the time suggested, why don't you go look at the story? And so I wrote a story. It landed on the front page. And the story suggested that there had been a recurring pattern of brother pitted against brother. First with Robert and his brother Peter, and then with Robert's own sons, Michael and Timothy. And the story I ended up writing suggested that the Robert Mondavi Corporation was on the verge of getting sold or being broken up. So, that story caused quite a sensation in the Napa Valley, and let me just say I was not the most popular person in the Napa Valley either. But I did get an email from a publisher in New York who had read the story and asked if I was interested in writing a book about it. I really didn't know, and in the meantime, I'd been invited to a very wonderful event up at Meadowood in St. Helena, and this was the Napa Valley Wine Auction. Has anybody here been to the Napa Valley Wine Auction? You've been to Meadowood, so maybe anybody here been to the Napa Valley? A few of you, okay, quite a few of you. So Meadowood, as you probably recall, is at it's kind of at the end of the valley, and it's a very beautiful spot. And so I jumped in my VW station wagon, went to Meadowood where the auction was being held, and I got seated at the Trinchero family's table, which was right next to the Mondavi family's table. It was a super hot day in this tent, and there were 2,000 people. And as you guys some of you probably know, the Napa Valley Wine Auction is famous because in the year 2000, at the height of the dot-com boom, a single bottle of wine sold for $500,000 at that auction. Granted, it was Screaming Eagle, and it was a very big bottle of Screaming Eagle. But, I was sitting there with the Trincheros, broiling hot, and I asked for some ice cubes in my glass of white wine. So, good, okay. We have enough knowledgeability about it. I was immediately branded a newbie. So I decided, it was a different world, that auction, and I decided I am going to try to do this story. But as I mentioned, the Wall Street Journal story did not make me particularly popular in Napa Valley, and the Mondavi family did not want to speak with me. So I basically sought out every single former employee, rival, extended family member, anybody who would talk to myself and my researcher who I was working with. And we ended up speaking to more than 250 people for the House of Mondavi, and doing more than 500 hours of interviews. And we looked at tens of thousands of pages of legal documents and corporate documents. And the story we were trying to put together was a story that spanned a century and took place over 5 continents and involved 4 generations of this very interesting family. So, to my husband's dismay, I jumped on a plane and went to the village in Italy that Robert Mondavi's mother and father had come from, the Italian village of Sassoferrato. And you can see Rosa and Cesare over in that picture. And Cesare had left the village first, and he had traveled by steamship, come through Ellis Island, made his way to the iron ore mines of Minnesota, and then eventually moved himself and his childhood sweetheart, Rosa, to the town of Lodi, which is in the Central Valley of California. And they were buying grapes at that point. And they had 4 children, Mary, Helen, Robert, and Peter. Okay, and eventually, so they did very well in that grape wholesaling business. They earned enough money from that to send their 2 sons to Stanford University. And after Robert graduated from Stanford, he ended up going up to St. Helena and convincing his dad to buy the old Charles Krug winery in 1943. This is during the Second World War, of course. The patriarch Cesare put one condition on that purchase, and that was that his 2 sons, Robert and Peter was the younger son, would work together in this family business. And the winery became the focus of their new family enterprise, which still at this point spanned both the Central Valley and now the new Napa Valley enterprise. But when Cesare died in 1949, the leadership of the family passed to the matriarch, to Rosa. And she found that she really couldn't handle these 2 boys. And the conflict between her 2 sons came to a head at a family gathering in the late autumn of 1965 in Lodi. And Robert and Peter were walking together. And Peter brought up something that had stuck in his craw for a long time. And it was that Robert, unlike Peter and his wife, but Robert and his wife had been invited to the Kennedy White House for a dinner honoring the Italian president. And Robert bought a mink coat at a very nice department store in San Francisco and put the price of that mink coat on his company expense account. Well, he was an honorable man. He fully intended to pay that money back, but he hadn't. And so his younger brother nudged him about this, and he said, you never paid that money back, implying that he had stolen from the family. Well, Robert tells him, say that again, and I'll hit you. And Peter says it again. And Robert warns him, take it back. And Peter won't take it back. And so Robert hits his younger sibling once and then hits him again. And by one account, there's just one account, these two brothers, now imagine, they're both in their 50s at this point, two brothers rolling around in the dust, curses flying. And I've got to say, this story has probably gotten better and better over the years. Family telling it, and it's now a famous story in the wine business, and I'm sure many of you have heard it. Robert actually ended up grabbing Peter around the throat, throttling him, and apparently leaving a mark on his neck. Well, you can only imagine what Mama Rosa thought about that when she saw what had happened to her younger child, a man who's still alive, Peter's still alive, and people in Napa Valley still call him Babe, which was the family nickname. So basically, Robert is banished from the family business. And he starts over, and this is in 1965, 1966. He starts over by journeying a few miles down Highway 29, which is the artery that runs through the Napa Valley, to Oakville. And he has almost no cash. His money is locked up in the family business. But he has very good friends, and he has grape growers who believe in him. He has a tendency to have very good relationships with people over the years. And so he manages to raise enough money to build the first major winery in the Napa Valley since Prohibition. And Robert, as I mentioned, was then in his 50s, and he had 2 of his 3 children in private schools. And, you know, I really admire him. He had the personal resilience to start over at that point in time. So in 1966, he starts the Robert Mondavi Winery. That's one of my favorite slides on the bottom there, and that's a blessing of the grapes. And that was an old tradition, probably brought from Italy, where people would, at harvest, they would ask a priest to come, their parish priest, and to say a blessing over the grapes. So he starts the Robert Mondavi Winery, and the Robert Mondavi Winery is significant because it basically starts putting California wines on the map, and it borrows ideas from the Grand Cru producers of France. So meanwhile, you can just imagine what the folks at the Charles Krug Winery are thinking about this. The new winery is getting a lot of attention, and the Charles Krug, his younger brother Peter, was not happy about it. And so essentially, Peter led an effort to kind of squeeze Robert out of his rightful profits at Charles Krug. Robert turned around and had the fortitude to sue his elderly mother, Mama Rosa. He sued Peter, and he sued his 2 sisters in the early 70s when they tried to take some of his share of the profits from the Charles Krug Winery. And the lawsuit, Mondavi versus Mondavi, became a landmark case in California legal history. And the judge ruled in Robert's favor and ordered, for the first time, the largest dissolution of a profitable business in the state's history at that time. One of the saddest parts, and we read the trial documents, we read the depositions, we read, you know, everything we could. And one of the saddest parts of the story is that Rosa died during the trial, and her family truly was torn apart in this dispute over essentially money. So like his own father, Robert also insisted that his 2 sons work together. And Robert's son's Michael, you can see him standing next to Robert. Robert's got his finger up. Michael's right next to him. Michael had been groomed from very early age to join the family business. But because of the rupture between Robert and his brother Peter and the rest of the family, Michael wasn't invited to join Charles Krug, so he joined his dad working at the Robert Mondavi winery. And of course, that was kind of a tough challenge. Robert Mondavi was a very, very charismatic man, and it's always hard to be in that kind of shadow. Now, the other son, Timothy, didn't really even want to join the Robert Mondavi winery, but Robert pushed him to come aboard. And just like himself and his own brother, he slotted his sons into exactly the same roles. He slotted Michael into the sales role. He slotted Timothy into the winemaking role. Robert was more of the marketer. Peter was more of the winemaker. Robert also sought out the French, and who were at the time considered the best winemakers in the world. And he struck up a friendship with the colorful Baron Philippe de Rothschild, who was a famous bon vivant, and he liked to conduct business in bed. That photograph there is the label designer for the Robert Mondavi winery, a woman named Susan Pate, and he would summon her to his bed in the chateau to do business. Her husband was on that trip, by the way. And across the highway from Highway 29 from the winery, let me go back, Opus One, which was the joint venture between Mondavi and the Rothschilds, was built. And you can see it there. People to this day still think it's kind of a weird-looking winery, and some people compare it to a spaceship plunked down in the middle of Oakville. I love it, but it's a little unusual. And so the Mondavi siblings were very much involved in the business, and they became the closest thing kind of to the Kennedys of the American wine industry. You see Michael, he's standing up, Timothy sitting down, and the daughter Marcy is next to her father. And Michael in particular looked at Italy's ancient wine dynasties, the Frescobaldis, the Antinori families, as templates for how to create a long-lasting family business. And like the Kennedys, there were some romantic complications. Robert's long-standing love affair with an employee of his winery, Margrit Beaver, caused a lot of friction with his grown-up children over the years. And likewise, there were pretty wild parties back then in the 70s. This is a party called an Out of Africa party, and they shipped animals to the winery in Oakville. And this is, and they're giving the elephant a little sparkling wine there, as you can see. So there are lots of great parties. Meanwhile, there's this microscopic pest lurking in the vineyards called phylloxera in 1993. And Mondavi, like many other wineries in the area, had to do massive replanting. And of course, that would cost a lot of money. So what to do? To finance the replanting, they decided to go public. And after studying such companies as the Sulzbergers, which control the New York Times, and the Grahams at the Washington Post, they decided to set up a dual-class shareholder structure that gave the family about 80% of the voting control of the winery. So at the time of the IPO in 1993, they believed the company was truly takeover-proof and that they were on their way to creating America's leading wine dynasty. And they were grooming the fourth generation to take their place at the family businesses as well and to inherit the kingdom when the time came. So, the question I was trying to answer when I came to this story in 2004, 2005 is, okay, so the family controls 80% of the voting stock. How in the world would they land in a situation of a forced takeover? How could they be forced to sell out if they didn't want to sell out? Well, the answer, in short, I'm not going to tell you the entire answer. I hope you read my book. But the answer was that Robert became financially overextended. That's one of the answers, through his philanthropic gifts in California at a time when the company, under Michael's leadership, ended up trying to do too many things at once in Chile, with Disney, all over the place, in Europe. And ironically, the Mondavis, who made their name producing higher quality California wines, at least that's what they talked about. They really made the bulk of their money making Central Valley wines, ended up selling out to Constellation Brands of New York. Now, I wonder if anybody in this esteemed room has ever tried a delicious wine called Richard's Wild Irish Rose. Anybody tried it? Okay, it costs $2 a bottle, and most people drink it out of brown paper sacks. So that's how Constellation Brands made its money initially. And the forced sale was very bittersweet for the Mondavis, but it also led them to new business ventures. And true to their characters and their business philosophies, Tim, the younger winemaking son, is now producing an ultra-premium $140 bottle wine called Continuum that's gotten excellent reviews, very good reviews. Michael is focusing on lower-end wines, $10 a bottle, $15 a bottle, something like that, through a company called Folio Wine Partners. Both are in business with their families, but not really with each other, and they don't seem to interact very much. Copia, the food and arts center in Napa that Robert poured much of his fortune into, ended up going bankrupt. And the home that Robert and Margrit built, which was quite a spectacular home. At one point, anybody remember Robin Leach, the Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous guy? Well, Robin Leach was going over in a helicopter over Robert Mondavi's home. And it's a 10,000 square foot home on a hill in Yountville, one bedroom home with an indoor swimming pool. And Robin Leach intoned that Robert Mondavi was the model for Falcon Crest, which maybe he was, maybe he wasn't, I don't know. But This home recently sold. It was big news in California real estate news. And Margrit Mondavi, Robert's widow, I think, again, true to character, remains the only family member still working at the Robert Mondavi winery. And with that, I will leave you. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Again, the House of Mondavi, and we do have copies for sale. Frank, you wanted to talk about
Sure.
Your personal relationship with Bob Mondavi. Is that correct?
Well, I certainly knew him individually.
Go ahead. Yeah, you can stay there. It's
I
fine.
can stay here. All right. I was posted into the wine coverage business in the early 70s by my bosses at the New York Times. So I don't really know much about wine, which I just seem to have heard from a friend here. And they said, this is the New York Times, you'll learn what you have to learn. And I did. Shortly thereafter, I'd been reading, and I picked up the idea of going to California and went out, rented a car, didn't let anyone know I was coming. I wanted to drive around and see what there was to see. And driving down Route 29 in the Napa Valley, I saw the Mondavi winery. So I said, well, if we're going to start, let's start there. Parked the car, went up, rapped on the door, rang a bell, I forget what it was. And a woman came out and said, yes. And I said, well, I work for the Times, read some stuff about wine, and I wanted to reach Bob Mondavi. Oh, she said, okay, come on in. Not used to that sort of thing. We're used to, do you have an appointment? Do they know you're coming? Sit here and we'll come back to you. I came in and I sat down, barely sat down, and he came running out from the back of the winery, and he said, gee whiz, it's really nice to meet you. I said, yeah, well, it's nice to meet you too. He said, are you free for lunch? I said, yes, as a matter of fact, I am. And we went back, and he was having a lunch, and I wrote down some of the people who were there, and including his brother, who he really wasn't. This is in 1974, I think it was. He himself was in bad shape financially. He had a lot of problems with his brother, but the brother was there. Some of the other people who came were Mike Gergich, who had been the winemaker for him for a few years and quit because he knew that there was no future for anybody being in the Mondavi winery if your name wasn't Mondavi, or Mondavi, as it was still pronounced by some of the people who worked there and some of the people in the family. Brother Timothy, who was the head of the Great Christian Brothers wine business at that time, was there. And Andrei Chalachev. Chalachev was the winemaker and guru for Beaulieu Vineyards. They had hired him, Georges de la Tour had hired him in France and brought him to California, which he loved. He was one of the very early people who said there is a great future here in California and in the United States. And the guest of honor turned out to be Len Evans, who none of us knew. Bob knew who he was. He was Mr. Wine in Australia. He had gone to Australia as a tennis pro, maybe to have set up lessons at school, got enamored by wine and became a wine man, became the number one wine man. Little short fellow, dynamic personality, just like Mondavi. And he had come with a wine that nobody had ever heard of, which was called Grange Hermitage, which still goes as one of the very great wines of Australia. They've taken the Grange off. It's just known as Hermitage. Everybody tasted the wine, me included, knowing very little, keep my mouth shut, I did. And Chalachev, who was as dramatic as Mondavi ever was, got up. He was short, little guy, maybe just barely 5 feet. Walked over around the table, lunch was on the table, half of it facing out on the vineyards. And he got in front of Mondavi, or in front of Len Evans, and he got down on one knee, and he said, this is the only thing I can do to praise the wine you have brought here. And he did get up, and we all drank the wine, and with the other wines, the Mondavi wines. And this was my introduction to Robert Mondavi. This was his own party. He had serious problems financially. His brother, whom he didn't speak to ordinarily, was there. this was the way he ran the wine business. And it was the perfect way to get to know something about the wine business, how it was collegial and something that everybody who was involved in loved. And very shortly after the lunch, I went with him back to his home. We had a drink. He wanted to sit with me more. I said, no, not today. I have to learn more. It'd be stupid and talk about something I don't know anything about. That was my first visit with him. That was in the 70s, lasted for almost 40 years. And I never forgot that first meeting. The one thing also that I had there, we all had, was the 1968 Beaulieu Vineyards Georges de la Tour Cabernet. And I know it's just emotional and probably not logical at all, but I can never remember having had a wine as great as that particular 1968 Cabernet. I still keep looking for it. And that was my first meeting with him. I'll tell you about some of the other things later on. Thank you.
Thank you. Our third speaker is Tyler Colman, author of Wine Politics. Tyler?
Thanks. It's great to be here and follow up on these great presentations so far. But what I wanted to focus on was more of the legacy of Robert Mondavi. I don't know, maybe Charles, maybe I should have been last, but the die is cast now. So, but what I want to talk about was his legacy, and in particular, that the legacy was mixed, as Julia points out, with family feuds and financial mismanagement. But I want to focus on two aspects of his legacy. One, his love of place, and two, his love of food and wine. And so I think those are trends that are now coming back into fashion with California wine, and it's something that's very important in the story of wine in America now, as I see it. And so I think that first of all, his legacy with place is important because when he came back, he did go on this walkabout that Julia alluded to after the family feud with his brother, the falling out with his brother. And so he came back invigorated about what he learned in Europe, and he learned about places, specific vineyards. He went to Bordeaux and to Italy and visited top sites, and he wanted to make a premier winery in Napa Valley, and he wanted to do it right there at that Colman vineyard on Highway 29. Actually, quite a large vineyard, but very very esteemed vineyard. And so he was interested in place, and so I think that's an important theme. I think another aspect that's an important part of his legacy is wine as a companion with food and a part of a meal. And I think that fits in with the series here very well, and indeed may be the reason that we're talking about him here today. So it's worth mentioning and flagging for us. But Mondavi, as Frank pointed out, meeting him at a lunch, he did have a lot of lunches, spontaneous and planned. And one thing, he was very generous in that he didn't just showcase his own wines at these lunches. When I talk with wine makers today, one question I like to ask them is, if I stop by your house on Tuesday night, which wine would I find on the table? And you can tell the true wine enthusiasts from the salespeople, because the salespeople always say, well, I'll have one of my wines, but the true wine enthusiasts will say, oh, I just had a great Riesling the other night, or a Cru Beaujolais, or what have you, And Robert Mondavi was like that, encouraging people to bring their own wines, as Frank illustrated, and compare them with his. And so, but he liked wine, having wine at the table, and enjoying wine with food. And so that's really very much in this Jeffersonian tradition. Thomas Jefferson, of course, was the best friend of the vine, friend of wine lovers that ever occupied the White House. And he thought that wine was an antidote to the ardent spirits of his day, notably whiskey, that was plaguing the nation, really. I don't know if you saw Ken Burns' great 3-part documentary this past fall on Prohibition, but it really was a tremendous issue. And so Thomas Jefferson saw wine as a drink of moderation. And so in that same tradition, it goes so well with food. And so Mondavi really epitomized that, and as we saw with Copia, certainly too. And the wines. So he ultimately wanted the wines to be enjoyed at table, and ended up producing an entire range of wines for an entire range of tables at which they could be served, from the lowly tables to the highest tables. But one thing that he didn't do too much in his career that is notable is chase points. And the wine industry over the past couple of decades has come to, for better or worse, to be driven by point scores, the scores of critics who most often rate wines on a so-called 100-point scale, although it's not really using all 100 points. The scale, in fact, shrinks every year, the relevant points, in part due to a phenomenon akin to grade inflation. Now I think it's about a 6-point scale, but it masquerades as a 100-point scale. But Robert Mondavi didn't really chase points too much, but it was notable that for the 1998 and 1999 vintages that Robert Parker gave the wines quite damning reviews. And so when I actually was speaking with Tim Mondavi a couple years ago, he told me that was really, it really did sting, those reviews. And you actually noticed their winemaking style change at that point. And soon after that, Michel Roland, a consulting winemaker from Bordeaux, whose wines were often lavished or are often lavished with high scores from Robert Parker, was involved at the Mondavi winery. So you did notice their style shift quite a bit. And I had the opportunity to taste, to have a vertical tasting of Robert Mondavi's top wine, the Reserve. It's called simply the Reserve, from the 1970s through to about 2006, a couple of years ago. And all the wines were from the winery's cellars, so they were in good condition. And you really could notice that the wines of the 70s had this wonderful Cabernet character and were quite lean. The 80s were a bit more mixed, although there were some nice wines in there. In the 90s, you could see this sort of drift a little bit more toward fuller body wines, although not too much. And that was ultimately what Robert Parker whacked Tim Mondavi over the head for. But then toward the 2000s, you just see them go right over into the quite full throttle style of higher alcohol and much more oak treatment on the wines. And so that was a distinct shift. But it's sort of interesting because now we're really moving. There's a large section of California wine that is actually moving away from that model of selling and making wine. And I think that's really an exciting development that is a major part of what could be considered Robert Mondavi's legacy. And if he were alive today, I'm sure he'd be very approving of this trend, because now there are a lot more wineries who aren't chasing point scores and are actually making wines to be made with dinner tonight. What a concept, huh? And so you see a lot of winemakers harvesting a bit earlier now, which means that the alcohol levels are lower. And so they've got a little bit more acidity in the wines. I mean, the California climate makes high alcohol wines, or can make high alcohol wines, quite effortlessly, because there's such a long growing season, long and dry growing season. So it is easy to do that. It's more of a challenge to make a more food-friendly wine. The trouble is that the higher alcohol wines tend to be sort of monstrous, sort of sumo wrestlers of the wine world, and hard to pair with wine. It might be fine as a cocktail, and many of them are enjoyable in that way, but but they are hard to pair with food. And so now what you see is this emphasis on place. A lot of smaller vineyards, very exciting new generation of wine makers are often working with established vineyards and sort of breathing a new life into California wine. I think it's a very exciting time for California wine, and there are a few emphasizing new varieties, and so moving beyond the sort of Cabernet, Chardonnay hegemony, and looking at all different grape varieties, and so it's really a fascinating and exciting time. If you want, I can flag a few of the producers who are working in this vein, because maybe you'll know them and you'll be able to understand what I'm talking about. But I'm thinking of Wind Gap, where Pax Maley actually was a Parker. He made these big Syrahs that got a lot of Parker points, and then he's actually done a complete had a Damascene conversion, and now is making these 12.5% alcohol Trousseau Gris, for example. He told me past summer when I visited him at the winery, he said that that was his favorite wine. He couldn't stop drinking it right now. So, but yeah, Copin, Wells Guthrie had a similar conversion. Arnaud Roberts, certainly the Pinot Noirs of Hirsch or Littorai or Anthill or Kutsch, Pay, and certainly Reese, which has come on the scene with tremendous amount of force in the past just 5 years. Really exciting story. So, but I think this is a really positive direction for California wine, and I think it's a really positive part of what could be construed writ large as Robert Mondavi's legacy. So, thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Tyler. Charles?
Good evening. I like to think of Robert Mondavi sort of as the Julia Childs of wine. Julia Childs did for food in many ways what Robert Mondavi did for wine, only Julia Childs did it with French food, and Robert Mondavi did it with California wine. And I think his influence, not only in California, but throughout the world, is something that I think, even with everything we said about him, is underestimated. He introduced many new techniques into California: cold fermentation, CO2, nitrogen, tanks, and also he was a promoter of different types of wine. In fact, one of the early stories, he had a wine called White Pinot, and nobody knew what it was, and he figured out it was Chenin Blanc. And he decided, well, what's a good name for it? Try to name it something else, but he couldn't think of anything, so he named it Chenin Blanc. And then he added 2% residual sugar to it, and it sold like 40,000 more cases than it did the year before. And then he came across Sauvignon Blanc, and he said, well, we needed a good name for that. And he decided to call it Fumé Blanc. And this, of course, took off. And I heard him say once that he actually should have patented the name Fumé Blanc, because now California winemakers do use Fumé Blanc. So I think he did a lot of things. He was a promoter. As was mentioned at the winery, he had chefs there, he had music. You could go to the winery, you could take tours, and he was constantly promoting California wine. He also, unfortunately, got himself involved with the Italians, and he got himself involved with a wine called Ornellaia, which is a Super Tuscan. The people who in the audience know me know that I have no love for Super Tuscans. And he got himself involved with the Frescobaldi family, and they were partners for a while, but this didn't work out at all. And after a while, he had to back out of that. And finally, when he sold to Constellation, the Frescobaldis bought the other 50% of Ornellaia, and now they own 100% of Ornellaia. He was much more successful with Baron Rothschild with the Opus One. And he also had another line of wines called La Famiglia, which you don't really hear about anymore, which is a line of wine which you had all of these esoteric Italian grapes like Tokai, Barbera, Dolcetto, Nebbiolo, growing in California. And this, I do believe, was a complete disaster. He closed the winery. He kept the name, but I think sold the facility, and now I think they just make a Barbera and a Pinot Grigio from this. But in my opinion now, California at this point, and here I go on to my soapbox, here is California, in my opinion, is the tail that wags the dog. California, for many years, I think, has actually controlled the wine world because the Super Tuscans, they're like California wines. They're big, they're oaky, they're over-extracted wines. That a very famous man who Tyler referred to Michel Rolland. I refer to him as Dark Vader. Because once he goes to a winery, they go to the dark side, oaky, extracted, big wine, so forth and so on. So the Italians sold out right away to California. The French, it took them a little longer because they're traditionalists, but yet you would never see a name of a grape on a bottle of French wine. Now you do. And they're making these wines much more in the California style than they once did. And I think this is a problem, and I just hope that Tyler is right, that these winemakers are going back to doing wine as wine should be. And fortunately, being not quite as old as Frank, but almost, I've had 73 and 74 Mondavi Cabernet, which is a fabulous wine. And at the Winemeter Guild, we had the other wine, Peter Mondavi's wine, the Krug, Charles Krug, 1966 Charles Krug. It was fabulous. It was 12% alcohol. The current Charles Krug is 16% alcohol. It has nothing to do with global warming. Global warming, 1 degree in the last 50 years. They want to make this wine because they think, like people, what's his name, Robert Parker, I won't forget his name too, and a few other ones think that this is what Americans like to drink. Big, high alcoholic wine, over-extracted wine. And recently I was on a cruise with 2 California winemakers, and one of them said, well, if you want insipid wine like Bordeaux, which is has no taste, is acidic, is tannic. You don't want wine like that. You want big, over-extracted, jammy wine. That's what you want. That's what Americans really like. Of course, I disagree 100% with that, and we were nice to each other, but he kept on giving me a dirty look all the time. So it depends upon what kind of wine you want. And I think Tyler pointed out also, and I have a quote from Robert Mondavi about what he thought of food. And it is that he believed that wine and food. Wine is more than an alcoholic beverage. It is actually a food, a beverage which complements fine cuisine. And I think they did lose their way in the 80s and 90s, and yes, it was more than Parker. I think it was the Wine Spectator also that came down on them for making wines that tasted like wine and not over-extracted wine or stand-up wines which you drink. And maybe someone will bring up the Judgment of Paris. Well, how come California wine, but did so well in the Judgment of Paris? Well, I have the Judgment of Charles. And that is, if you put a big, heavy, oaky California wine on the table next to a Bordeaux or Barolo, which is on oak, you see at the end of the night which bottle is still half full. And it'll be the California wine. These wines are made to win contests. They, of course, are heavy. Few sips of them, you say they're very good, but you can't drink them all through the night. So Robert Mondavi, to sum up, because I know all you want some wine now, taste the wine. And again, Julie, the Constellation, she brought up what they do. They also brought, Constellation also took over one of my favorite wineries, Ruffino, the Chianti producers. Wines last 50 and 60 years. They changed the whole thing. They now put Cabernet, they put Merlot, they put them in barriques. And barriques, of course, to me, except used by the French, no one should use them, should throw them all out. And the wine has changed completely. And I don't think Mondavi wine is going to go the way of the wineries that Tyler mentioned, but they're going to become more barriqued, more heavy, more jammy, because that's what they think Americans like. So please, when you raise a glass of wine, make sure it doesn't taste like something you get from Welch's. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. We have a little time for a few questions. I had actually one question. Tyler and Charles already answered it, but Julie, I wanted to ask you, what is Mondavi's legacy?
Ooh, what is his legacy? Well, I love Charles's comparison of him with Julia Child. And I think his legacy also might have been to bring focus to California's wine industry and kind of pull the industry up, because for a long time it was making really terrible wine. And Robert Mondavi was very generous, shared technical information, and really changed the way California producers approach their business.
Frank, do you have comments on that? What is Robert Mondavi's legacy?
I think his legacy is having been a star in the wine business and setting a whole country interested, making a whole country interested in wine. And he didn't let them down. He gave them great wines to begin their interest in wine. And it exists. I mean, he's gone now, but what he developed for us is still among us, still with us. And I think that's a wonderful thing to be able to look back on and see that you've created something as well as he did.
We have some time for questions. This is being taped, and we need you to have a microphone in order to ask a question. So,
some of the newer wineries and winemakers that Tyler mentioned, I know several of them, not all of them, but Wingap, Litterai, Arnott Roberts are Sonoma winemakers. And I'd be interested to hear, we've been talking about California kind of generically, but how is Sonoma more cutting edge than Napa, or is that an oversimplification? And how do you see Sonoma versus Napa these days?
I think that's a great question. And Napa has become really seen in some ways as a premier growing area for Cabernet Sauvignon, and really tied their fortunes to Cabernet Sauvignon in to a large extent. They've also tied their fortunes to cult wines and making very expensive wines and the pursuit of points to sell these wines. And so it's no surprise that that it's been a little bit difficult in the past few years there with the economic downturn, reducing some demand for these top, very expensive wines, although that demand now is rallying. But Sonoma, though, on the other hand, has a more diverse economic base. And so the real estate prices are not quite as high, so there can be more experimental plantings. There are also some really terrific older vineyards there. For example, Zinfandel, that's 100 years old. And so these, a lot of the vineyard owners face a choice of trying to sell that fruit, which is low yielding, or uprooting it and planting it with, Cabernet Sauvignon or something like that. And so a lot of these younger wineries now are really are providing a market for these older vines, and also it's beyond Sonoma. There's also other cooler areas, and there's really an emphasis on seeking out the cool areas in California now, particularly. With global warming as one cause for seeking out cooler areas, and the other is the search for lower alcohol wines. And so Reese, which is owned by Silicon Valley millionaire, who's also a Burgundy enthusiast, Kevin Harvey, and so he is relentless in his pursuit for these cool sites. And so he does extensive mapping and tracking and soil surveys and things to find really cool sites, climatologically cool, not trendy. But he does a ton of research and actually failed to even get ripening on his Syrah in one of his vineyards last year. It was so cool. So anyway, I think that's a really interesting change and trend change for California wine, which has so often produced so many of these jammy, hedonistic fruit bombs.
Another question?
I have a comment.
Oh, comment, Charles.
I think that in Napa, they're still trying to make Bordeaux. And you still have a lot of people comparing their wines to Bordeaux, which, of course, they're not. And, of course, I think some of them also are trying to make Chardonnay, which still, they think it's white Burgundy, and that's a failure. What they really had in California was a new style. I mean, both what they do with the Cabernet and it's not the Bordeaux, it's not white Burgundy, it's a whole new style. And if you like that style, you'll like it. And if you don't, you don't. I think that it's much more in Napa than it is in Sonoma.
This group wants the wine. Is that the message? No questions at all? Okay. Our panelists will be here.
Another question.
We do have another question. Please.
I'm just curious because Robert Parker has been mentioned so much this evening. Why did he become so powerful, or how did he become so powerful?
We'll see you at the
We
next
could do a
panel.
whole thing on that. We have a whole seminar on that one.
There's a book on it, too.
Yes, sir.
No one wants
couple
to
of them.
answer it.
I'll give it a Frank no more than that. But basically, he made his fortune on the 1982 vintage of Bordeaux. When everybody came out against it, he came out as saying it's the greatest vintage of the millennium, or 6 millenniums, whatever it was. And that's how really he built his thing on that. And also, his idea of if Parker gives you the high score, you're going to sell the wine at auction for a lot of money. I used to look at Parker, and whatever I didn't like, I would buy, because it would be less expensive, and I liked it. So.
More questions? Okay. I would like to thank our panelists. They were superb. I would also like to thank Fabio and the New School for hosting this event. And Pam Tillis, who is standing in the back, who really does all the administrivia for these programs and does a superb job. And the most important person here, the person who's serving the wine to our right. So with that note, we will take a break, and we look forward to you. Fabio, you didn't mention the upcoming programs. You wanted to quickly mention them?
So on March 21st, we'll have a panel on food history. Why do we care about it? And it will also be the launch of a 6-volume cultural history of food, of which I've been the general editor, together with Peter Scholiers at the Free University in Brussels. So there will be some of the authors that have contributed to this 6 volumes work, and we'll be discussing why are we doing food history, what does it mean for us, and so on. On April 24th, we are going to have a panel on Jewish food traditions around the world. In the U.S., in Israel, in Italy, we're going to have a group of panelists that will talk to us about the different aspects of Jewish traditions. June 24th, the New School, together with the New York University, is actually hosting the annual meeting of the Association for the Study of Food and Society. So many of the people that work on food and write about food and study food will be here for a 4-day conference. The first 2 days here at the New School and then at NYU. And then last but definitely not least, on June 6th, we're going to have a panel on what it means for women to make it in the world of professional chefs and professional kitchens. So we're very excited about that one, and we're gathering a pretty strong panel. So you're more than welcome to participate, and if you want to keep in touch with us, we can send you all the information. You can just leave your email address as you leave the room. Thank you very much for coming, and enjoy your wine.